Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for the Safety Center's May webinar. My name is Jamie Sullivan, and I am the manager for the Safety Center. Today's webinar is called Incorporating Safety Data in the Planning Process at the Rural Level. It looks like, based on our polls that you guys have filled out, that we have quite a few of you joining us today. It looks like, as usual, we have a pretty good mix of locations, with most of you coming from the Midwest and the West. About 60% between the two, and then we have about 14% of you from the Southeast and about 5% from the Northeast. It does also look like today that we don't have any big groups joining us, but as always, if you are and you just have not filled out the poll, please make sure to send a list with names and email addresses to us at info, I-N-F-O, at ruralsafetycenter.org. And that just makes sure that we have an accurate list of who attended today and that we're able to send you out our survey in case you're looking for certificates of completion. It also looks like we have a pretty good mix of people who are joining us as well from what organizations you're with. Looks like we have about 28% from local transportation departments, about 12% from other federal, state, or local government agencies, 24% from educational institutions, 12% private consultants, and about 8% state DOTs. And it looks like most of you are joining us by computer only today, so listening in on your speakers. I will remind those of you who are listening in on the phone to please make sure you have your computer speakers muted. And for any of those of you who are listening computer only, if you do have any audio issues today, we'd ask that you please dial in via phone. Sometimes the Wi-Fi or the internet makes it so the audio is a little bit difficult to hear. You will find the phone number to call in at the top left-hand corner of today's webinar. So I am going to move us over to our presentation and give you just a few more bits of information. So just a few more webinar logistics for you. Today's webinar will last for about an hour and a half. The webinar is being recorded, as all of our webinars are, and it will be archived on our website and available in about a week. For quality of the recording, everyone's phones have been muted during the presentation except the presenters. And again, if you're listening on the phone, please go ahead and mute your computer so you don't hear any feedback. To maximize today's presentation, you'll see in the top right-hand corner 4 arrows that point outward. If you press on that button, it will make the presentation itself full screen so that you'll be able to see it better. At the end of each section today, we will have time for question and answer. And this is going to take place via the chat pod. So at any time during the presentation today, you can feel free to put questions into the chat pod. And we will, once we stop for question and answer sections, we'll go back through the chat pod and ask those questions to our presenter. This way you don't have to wait until the very end. As you think of a question, you can go ahead and put that in the chat pod. There's also a handout pod at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. In that, you will find 2 resources that the presenters felt might be useful to you after looking at today's presentation, along with a PDF version of today's slides. All of those resources will also be available to you along with the archived version when we post it on our website as well. And lastly, we just want to point out that today's webinar will be followed up with 2 surveys. There will be one sent to you today. That survey for today is the one where you can select if you'd like a certificate of completion for today's webinar, and if you'd like us to send you the forms to fill out to be eligible for our CEUs, and those are handled by another department at Montana State University. In about 3 months, we'll send another follow-up survey just to find out what you've done with the information that you learned in today's webinar, whether or not maybe you shared that with a colleague, whether you have asked someone else to watch the webinar, whether or not you've gone out and taken a look at your data based on what you learned today. So just to see what actions you may have taken based on today's webinar. Today's presenters, we're lucky to have two of our team members from the Safety Center who work for Cambridge Systematics. We have Nicole Waldheim. Nicole leads the Transportation Safety Planning practice at Cambridge Systematics. Having previously served as the interim director of an MPO, she applies her firsthand knowledge of intricacies of the performance-based planning process to work with MPOs and RTPOs to integrate safety into long and short-range transportation planning documents. And we also have Dana Gaines as well from Cambridge Systematics. Dana has over 10 years of experience working with state DOTs to update and implement their state highway safety plans and helping MPOs identify opportunities to incorporate safety into the long-range planning process. Her research background and professional experience include developing and conducting surveys and interviews to collect transportation safety planning practices and culture challenges at state and local agencies. Dana has developed numerous transportation safety planning training workshops and courses, and again, we're very happy to have both of them here today to present for us. The goal of today's webinar is that once it is complete, you'll be able to summarize the elements of safety data and analysis and understand opportunities to utilize both in the transportation planning process. The learning outcomes that we hope you'll learn today are to summarize the purpose of transportation safety planning, to list approaches to collect safety data, to compare safety analysis methods, and to identify opportunities to apply safety data and analysis to the planning process. And before I do move the webinar over to our speakers, we do have one initial poll that we would like you guys to answer. So what has your agency done related to safety planning? Have you obtained crash data, conducted crash data analysis, developed a crash location priority list, identified safety performance measures, identified safety programs or projects, developed a safety plan or report, and participated in the state highway safety program or plan? So I'll give everyone just a few seconds to go ahead and fill that out. Okay, and it looks like at this point everyone has gone ahead and answered that poll. And it looks like our audience has a pretty good amount of safety planning that they have done. About 80% of you have obtained crash data, about 66% conducted analysis on this data, 58% done a crash location priority list, 47% identified safety performance measures, 56% done safety programs or projects, and about 53% for both of the last two, developing a safety plan and participating in the state highway safety plan. So that'll give our presenters a little bit more information as to where you all are in your safety data process. And at this point, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Dana to begin our webinar today. Dana?
Thank you very much, Jamie. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. The first segment of the webinar is going to focus on the purpose of transportation safety planning, and this is just to bring us all to the same page about why we're doing this and the importance of it. All right, so the importance of incorporating safety into the planning process. For a number of reasons, whether you are working with a local agency or a state DOT in a rural or urban area, there's a very important purpose in addressing severe crashes on public roads, even in non-metropolitan areas. As many of you know, there's a very large push to look at driving fatalities down, zero fatalities, destination zero deaths. There's many of those campaigns that are happening in various states and in some local jurisdictions. And in order to meet that goal, we will all be required to look at how we can address severe crashes on public roads, especially in some of the areas where we're seeing crashes more highly represented. Some other things to think about here include the low-cost countermeasures that can be used to address some high-risk roadway features, and helping your state or local agency meet their fatality and serious injury targets. And then, of course, ultimately, the one thing that we can all agree on is that saving lives is why we are all focused on safety and involved in this process. And we believe that if safety is highly integrated into the planning process, the result will be that we can save lives and reduce the number of people who are dying on our roadways. So just a few stats, because I'm sure most of you have seen these. Motor vehicle fatalities have leveled off, but we are seeing an uptick, and that uptick has all of us looking at what we can do differently and how we can implement countermeasures to reduce fatalities. If you notice in the second bullet, over 40,000 estimated motor vehicle fatalities in 2016. That was a 6% increase from 2015 and a 14% increase from 2014. And we are expecting or seeing similar types of trends in this year also. So one of the things that has also been very interesting to note is that even in 2014, motor vehicle fatalities were the single largest cause of death for persons aged 15 to 29. So as the National Center for Rural Road Safety, we do focus a lot on the rural safety issue and what is the context of rural safety. If you look at the percentage of the United States population that lives in rural areas, that's 19%, but the rural fatalities account for 51% of all fatalities, and that's looking at 2014 numbers. And that's also showing that 16,710 out of 32,675 traffic fatalities occurred in rural areas. So we are focused on the rural safety context because we think that there are a lot of opportunities to improve rural road safety, and that is the mission of the National Center for Rural Road Safety. And some contributing factors that we'd like to bring to light or talk about for rural crashes is roadway geometry, physical limitations, speed, exposure, and of course some other behavioral factors that we are all aware of, whether it's distracted driving, impairment. Those are all other issues that we're seeing in rural areas in addition to other areas. So what can we do? We know that all of you on the phone are not working for regional transportation planning organizations or RPOs or RTPOs, but we expect that you have some interest in the rural planning process, and specifically we want to talk a little bit about, well, what can a regional transportation planning organization planner do in the area of safety? And these are just some examples. With the structure of the RPOs or other regional organizations, there's a forum to identify regional issues and priorities and engage with a diverse group of stakeholders, especially when we talk about local governments. The regional organizations are usually in direct contact with the local governments, and we see the local governments as a very important player in the safety process when we're talking about the safety of local roadways. RPOs are also commonly conducting public involvement activities for their planning process. They're gathering information about how the public views all transportation issues, but safety could also be one of those. And the RPOs are also connected to local officials through the policy committee meetings or other interactions that may result as a part of their planning process. There's a number of ways that the two RPO positions that are most common, the planners and the GIS professionals, can also provide data analysis and crash mapping capabilities that can help in the safety planning process. But most importantly, the RPOs provide boots on the ground and can be a great champion for safety. Every RPO engages in some type of planning process to understand the regional transportation issues and needs, either through the development of a regional plan, by providing input into the statewide plan, or coordinating the development of other planning documents. The terminology may differ across agencies, but the basic elements of a transportation planning process include those that you're seeing in the boxes on the right of the screen. So we have public involvement and outreach, multidisciplinary coordination and input, data collection and analysis, and that's where the problem identification process takes place, the development of goals and objectives, identification of performance measures and targets, project prioritization and programming, and monitoring and evaluation. During this development, it could be the development of a regional plan. You would identify and collect input, or you could be identifying and collecting input for a statewide plan, or working with on some other type of plans, for example, a corridor plan or a specific modal plan. And this process would be used in either way. So today's webinar is going to focus primarily on the third principle here, collecting and analyzing crash and roadway data to identify transportation safety goals, objectives, and project priorities. What you're looking at here are the 7 transportation safety principles. And these principles are based on research, including a literature review, survey results, interview summaries, and input from an NCHRP research panel. And an expert working group. This is a conceptual framework for integrating and institutionalizing safety in the transportation planning process, and these are the different principles. Today's webinar will primarily focus on the third one, which is collecting and analyzing crash data.
And at this point, we're going to go ahead and take some questions. As I mentioned earlier, because phone lines are muted, we will be doing all questions through the chat pod. And it does look like we have a few in there already. I am going to move us over to our poll questions real quick. You'll notice that the chat pod is still there if you have further questions you'd like to ask. The 2 poll questions that we have for you at this time are, which of the following is not a principal transportation safety planning? And there are 3 options there, or 4 rather. Establish safety as a decision factor for the selection of transportation projects. Collect and analyze crash and roadway data to identify transportation safety goals, objectives, and project priorities. Identify safety performance measures and targets to track progress towards the safety goals and objectives, or none of the above. We also have another question about your role in the transportation safety planning at your agency. And this one is a select all that apply. There are options including attending statewide or regional safety meetings, analyzing crash data, coordinating with the DOT and or MPO staff to identify safety projects, partner with local jurisdictions to identify safety projects, write safety reports, or include safety in your transportation plans, and lastly, to conduct road safety audits. So we'll give you guys just a few minutes. Okay, and at this point it does look like the results have stopped coming in, so I am going to end the polls and broadcast those for you, Dana, if you'd like to go ahead and talk about the results of those.
Sure. For the first poll question, which of the following is not a principle of transportation safety planning? The first answer is establish safety as a decision factor for the selection of transportation projects. Collect and analyze crash and roadway data to identify transportation safety goals, objectives, and project priorities. The third option is identify safety performance measures and targets to track progress towards the safety goals and objectives. Or D, none of the above. The correct answer is D, none of the above, because A, B, and C, or the first three responses are indeed principles of the transportation safety planning process. For the second question, what role do you play in transportation safety planning at your agency? We have attend statewide or regional safety meetings. 47, almost 48% of you said yes. Analyze crash data, 62%. Coordinate with DOT and or MPO staff to identify safety projects, about 62%. 57% of you said that you partner with local jurisdictions to identify safety projects. 60% write safety reports or include safety and transportation plans. And about 40% conduct road safety audits. We have 29% who selected other, and it would be interesting to know what some of those other items are, and if you'd like to provide any of that information in the chat pod, that would be great too.
Perfect. Thank you, Dana. We do have a couple questions for you. The first is there a measure or estimation of the number of miles driven by rural versus urban drivers?
Right, so yeah, I was looking at this question while we were doing the poll. I believe that there are urban versus rural VMT numbers available, but I don't know that for sure. So that would be a question that we would want to get back to you on. Now, what I can tell you is that what we do know is, and I haven't seen these numbers recently, or I have seen these numbers, but I can't recall the exact correlation. But what we do know is that most of the vehicle miles traveled occur on the roadways that are not considered rural, but disproportionately more of the fatalities and serious injuries actually occur on those rural roadways. So, but there's also been a study that's shown that many of the fatalities and serious injuries also occur sort of at the fringes of the urban areas as you're going into rural areas. So I know that doesn't give you the specific stats that you're looking for, but yes, there is a higher proportion of rural fatalities and serious injuries versus the VMT on the rural system versus urban.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dana. Again, for those of you listening, if you did have any additional information as to what the other from your question on safety planning was, if you would like to put that in the chat pod, we can provide that information to the rest of the audience. And we're going to go ahead with the second section, Dana.
Thank you, Jamie. So the second section of this webinar is to talk about approaches to collect safety data. And since I think it was about 60% of you have collected and looked at your safety data, some of this will be familiar to you, and some of this might be new to others who have yet to do so or are interested in doing so. So we have a couple of questions to consider here. The first one, what types of data are available to address safety, and where can you go to obtain them? And we're going to explore both of those today so you can understand if you are interested in doing a safety plan or doing some work in the area of safety with your planning process, you can understand where you can go to find data, what kind of data is available, and how can it be used. What you're looking at here is a figure that is actually from the Federal Highway Applying Safety Data and Analysis Performance-Based Transportation Planning Guidebook, which is available online. And this figure is just showing the common types of traffic safety data. The bubbles that are in green address data sets in detail in the guidebook, and then there are other data sets that are not addressed in detail. But I'll talk you through those just a little bit. Of course, in the middle is the crash data. That is the data that all of us are familiar with, and most people primarily go to understand what kind of traffic safety issues they may have in their town, their city, their county, or their region, or even their state. The crash data is the foundation of the planning process where safety is concerned. For each crash that meets the minimum injury or property damage reporting threshold, a large set of information is collected and entered into a state database. So every state has a state crash database. But these other bubbles are showing some other data that you can, if you have access to it or can find it, can marry with or couple with your crash data to get a better understanding of why crashes are occurring, where they are occurring, and what are some of the circumstances around the occurrence of them. So at the top you have roadway data, and this is data that many agencies collect, and it tells you about the cross-section of the roadway at the location where the crash occurred, what type, how many lanes, any type of safety measures that are there. It depends on the state's roadway characteristics inventory, what they may have there, and those vary. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. We also have here traffic volume, driver and passenger data, vehicle data, injury control, and citation and adjudication data. So let's look at these a little bit more in detail. So for crash data, as I just mentioned, there's a state crash database that provides data on crashes that meet a minimum injury or property damage reporting threshold. And this set of information is collected and entered into the state database. It has information on why the crash occurs, and you also can see here the model minimum uniform crash criteria is a set of guidance on the data that is collected and provided, the criteria for what is collected and provided. So what is the process for collecting crash data? This figure is showing you how that happens, and some of you may already be aware of this. But the data standards, which we just talked about, MUC, are used to develop a crash report that is filled out at the crash scene. The data is stored in a state database. And most state DOTs or whomever owns or is responsible for the data provides access to various organizations or agencies that need it to do analysis and mapping. From there, you can develop your countermeasures and implement projects and evaluate them. So this is just showing how crash data is used in the planning process and how it goes from being a crash form to an actual piece of information used for transportation safety planning. So roadway data, let's talk about roadway data for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, states collect and inventory data on their roadway features and traffic elements. The box to the right is talking about the model inventory of roadway elements, or MIRE, and it's a recommended list of roadway characteristics to be collected. And then there's some examples shown there. These are physical attributes that are collected about the condition of the roadway, and we use those in some of our analyses that Nicole is going to talk about later in the presentation, how we can use those in terms of safety planning. Then, of course, there's also a traffic volume. All the states are required to collect and submit traffic count data so that they can understand traffic volumes, and the process by which that happens, or the system that that information goes into, is called Federal Highway Performance Monitoring System, or HPMS. This data set provides the ability to identify dangerous segments or intersections based on traffic volume, or VMT, as some of you will know it as, and it gives you the ability to compare and contrast different planning areas to understand where your priorities might be. So, if you would like to learn more about safety data, these are some examples of some opportunities to do so. Each state has a traffic records coordinating committee that's responsible for coordinating activities across the state in an effort to improve the timeliness, the accuracy, completeness, uniformity, accessibility, and integration of various data systems. A number of training and education opportunities may also be available in your state or region, either with your state DOT or your LTAP. The Strategic Highway Safety Plan meetings also provide information about safety data, and that's one of the benefits as a local or rural agency in participating in the strategic highway safety planning process. And finally, you can always meet with your DOT district or division person or headquarters staff if you have questions about data or have some specific needs that you haven't been able to address. So how do you obtain the primary sources of data? These are some of those here. Of course, your state's crash and roadway database, but also the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS, which most of you are probably aware of, provides fatality information. And then there's information on the Federal Highway Safety Data Program and some other opportunities here. It could be your transportation and safety planning documents, like your SHSP, your Highway Safety Plan, your Highway Safety Improvement Program, or your Long Range Transportation Plan, depending on what kind of data, safety data is included there. Some additional sources that you can obtain data from: local agencies. Many of them can provide data that may not be included in the state database. There's also qualitative data that may be gathered through the public input process through a survey or a public meeting. Maybe people in your community have participated in some kind of a public meeting and provided some information on traffic safety issues that concern them. There's also sometimes regional and local crash databases, and one of the places that we find could be a great source of information is your local law enforcement. They're on the roadways, they're working crashes, they know the areas where there's more problems or issues, and they are another set of eyes and ears. And then, of course, the last one here is your LTAP or TTAP. And both of these organizations can provide or have access to some data that could be helpful to you in your planning process. So at this time, you can direct any questions you have to the chat pod.
Thank you very much, Dana. And we are going to move over to the next poll break as well. We have 3 poll questions for you, and I won't read them all out this time because I know Dana will when we get to the answers. But as you're filling those out, a couple pieces of information have come in about the other safety planning that you guys do. For those of you, I believe it was about 28% that said there were other things that you do for safety. Some of those examples are local road safety plans, public outreach, coordination with law enforcement on traffic crash forms and data investigation, design exceptions based on safety analysis, and then safety target projections. So those are just a few of the pieces that have come in. We also had a question about what LTAP, TTAP was that was just in that last slide. And those are the local and tribal technical assistance programs that are available in the U.S. And thank you, Adam. Adam from FHWA did also post a link in the chat pod for anyone who is available or interested in finding out more about the LTAP and TTAP program. Okay, at this point it looks like most of you have finished answering the poll questions. I'm going to go ahead and broadcast those results. Dana, if you'd like to go ahead and talk through them, please.
Sure. For the first question, all states are required to collect and submit traffic count data to the following. A, Federal Highway Performance Monitoring System, Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS, neither A nor B, or both A and B. So the answer is A, and in this particular case it's A because we're talking about where they're required to collect and submit traffic count data. And that is to the Highway Performance Monitoring System, or HPMS, which we talked about earlier. The Fatality Analysis Reporting System is where crash fatality information is reported. So the next question is, what safety data do you use? The first option is crash. Second one, roadway, VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, other, and none. And we had, you were allowed to select multiple options. We had 98% to select crash data, 81% selected roadway data and is using roadway data, 56% VMT, and then 30% said other. So if there are any of you that would like to share what other safety data you use, if you could type that into the chat pod, we can talk about those at the next break also. The third question, how do you obtain your data? A state database, and you could select multiples here. B, FARS. C, generated report. D, a custom state tool. E, transportation and safety plans. And F, non-state agency data. So 83% obtain your data from the state database, 34% from FARS, 32% from a generated report, and 22% from a custom state tool, 29% from transportation safety plans like your SHSP or your long-range transportation plan. And then we have 39% who are getting non-state agency data. Very interesting. So we have folks who are getting data from a number of different sources. So Jamie, I think we have a question in the chat pod.
Yes, we do. So the first question is, have you looked at the recent work on collecting video conflict data where software evaluates the video?
No, I have not seen that recent work, Brian. And if you could provide or have any information about where, like a link or something that you could provide in the chat pod, that would be great. Would be very interesting to check out, and I'm sure others on the call would be interested in knowing about it too. Thank you.
And another question that came in, Dana, and I guess we'll ask you this question, but if there are others on the webinar who'd like to provide what they're using, you can go ahead and put it in the chat pod as well. But what software are agencies using that integrates with crash data to map and analyze?
Oh, that question, I could give you some examples because most of the names are, most of the states are actually giving their systems their own name. Like Ohio DOT has the GCAT software tool, but I can't tell you, I'm not versed enough in the area to be able to tell you what kind of software. Some of them are developing their own, but if those of you who are on the phone who have some experience in this area would like to respond and give us some examples or tell us about what software you're using. I also know that in some cases analysts actually take the crash data and the roadway characteristics data and they do the analysis themselves using multiple programs. So if you have a roadway characteristics data set or file, you would merge that with your crash data. And then if you have, if the data has the right location information, you can map it in GIS. So that is one way it can be done, but I'm sure that there are other ways that it can be done, and there may be some specific software tools or packages that agencies are using to do it, but many of them are actually building their own platform and providing an, access to local agencies through the platform.
Thank you, Dana. It does look like we have a few comments coming in on the same topic. So it says that Arizona is using AASHTO Safety Analyst. There's others who are using GIS. ArcMap, ArcGIS, GeoMedia, spreadsheet tools, and a couple of in-house software that's also been developed. And Brian did put the City of Bellevue's presentation on the video traffic conflict coding system, a link to that in the chat pod as well for anyone who is interested in that. We also have a comment from Missoula MPO saying that Montana DOT provides them with crash, vehicle, and person tables, which they turn into an access database. And the primary crash data includes lat and longs, which we derive points in ArcGIS, and the database can be connected to GIS as well. And then there's also one from FHWA's Federal Lands Highway Program, who says they'll soon be using that AASHTO Safety Analyst program as well. So there's a couple of great examples that came in through the chat pod. We also did have some examples of other data that's also being used, and those include pavement data, such as skid information, maintenance data, such as signs, guardrails, and previous projects, ADT, roadside hazard ratings, such as the USRAP program, and the Safety Center did host a webinar on the USRAP program a couple months back, so if you do go looking for the archived version of this webinar as well, there is an archived version of that webinar that was hosted here as well, so you can find out more about that program. And then we had someone else said that maybe it's not considered safety data, but that they also look into land usage when considering their safety projects, so whether or not there's schools, industry, or commercial near there.
Okay, those are some great other safety data options. And the one about land use, very, very important. You know, it's kind of, it's something that people think about when they see issues in land use and how they affect safety, but it's not all the time thought of when it's time to look at identifying projects or implementing them. So that's great.
Okay, and thank you very much, Dana, for your presentation. And at this point, we're going to turn it over to Nicole so she can do the third section of today's webinar.
Thanks, Jamie. So now that Dana has so nicely laid out for all of you how to obtain safety data, we're going to move on to discuss the different methods to analyze the data that you do have. And I noticed in the poll results, many of you said that you do work with data and do a lot of analysis, so this might be a refresher for some, but new information for others. So in this particular subsection, we're going to talk about the different types of safety analysis methods that you can use to either develop safety-specific plans or things that you can use to inform safety elements in your other transportation plans. So not just your long-range plan, but maybe a bike ped plan or a corridor plan. This is really applicable across any type of planning document. And we'll also talk about what the types of analysis will tell you and what kinds of results they produce. So this slide, I like this slide. It provides an overview of different types of safety analysis categories, and you can see those on the left. And then on the right are the questions that are answered by that type of analysis. So when you are getting started with your safety planning, or really any planning for that matter, typically you're going to ask yourself, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? So this chart actually provides you with a safety analysis guide. So for example, if you have data and want to compare fatalities for the jurisdictions in your planning area, you would conduct a benchmarking analysis. And if you want to know where crashes are occurring, you would look to contributing factors type analysis. So I think this is a good guide for helping you figure out what you want to achieve and then what types of analysis will actually help you get to that point in the process. So integrating safety into planning, it starts with an understanding of what are the scope and scale of the safety concerns in your planning area. And another way to refer to this is as a benchmarking analysis. So it's a simple exercise, and It does things like look at frequency of crashes or fatalities and or serious injuries. So even though you're just looking at some very high-level data, there's a lot of things that you can do with benchmarking analysis. For one, you can establish a safety baseline. So where are we? What are we starting from? What's the magnitude of our safety issue? Second is you can summarize annual or average data to evaluate and track safety performance. So with that being a federal requirement, benchmarking is an analysis type that can help you better understand the 5 required safety performance measures as well as any others that you might want to look at. Another thing this does is it demonstrates that you have a safety issue in your planning area. So you can say, look, in 2013, we had 100 fatalities. What are we going to do about that? It's something that you can use with your elected officials to make the case about how important safety is, or your other decision makers in your planning area. And then lastly, benchmarking allows you to compare safety across different areas. You can look at how one jurisdiction in your planning area compares to another to maybe figure out where to put some investments. You can figure out how your area compares against maybe some statewide numbers and averages to say, look, we're high, we're above the state rate. What are we going to do about this? So benchmarking analysis, it can take many forms. It can look different. So the chart on this slide just shows one example of what the results of benchmarking analysis might look like, just to give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about. So once you have a general understanding of the scope and scale of safety concerns through a benchmarking analysis, one thing that you can do is you can start digging into your safety story a little bit more. So contributing factors analysis really allows you to do this. It tells you the who, the what, the when, the where, and why people are involved or injured in crashes. And the objective of this analysis is it helps you understand the major safety trends in your community, and it also helps you understand what are the most prevalent issues that we're seeing. So again, there's a lot of different ways to show contributing factor information. The chart on the slide just shows one example of what an analysis, a contributing factor analysis might look like, but there's a number of other types of analysis within contributing factors. So you might be looking at things like age of people involved in crashes, or time of day crashes are occurring, or gender, or crash location. These are all outputs that you can see from contributing factor analysis, but really at the end of the day is it helps you understand more of what your safety problem is. It's giving you a sense of what the problem is and what are some of the things contributing to that problem. And it doesn't necessarily help you get very specific about programs and projects, but what it can help you do is start to think through some strategies in terms of how you can address these things. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different ways to show contributing factor analysis. So here's just a couple more of examples. So on the far left, it just shows crashes by gender. The middle graph shows crash prevalence by month, day a week, and time. And then the map on the right shows crashes by location. So these are all outputs of this type of analysis. And again, it just tells you more of the safety story so that you can start developing some solutions to address these things that you're seeing. So crash type, similar to contributing factor analysis, it tells you more of the story. It tells you a little bit different story. It can be reviewed to help you start understanding things like what is the manner of collision? Is it a rear end? Is it an angle? Is it a head-on? Was a pedestrian or bicyclist involved? It can tell you about crash severity, which crash types are more severe. So those might be ones that you would want to start focusing on to address. Also, what types of crashes are overrepresented. So those are some of the basics of crash type analysis, but crash type data can also serve as the foundation for a systemic analysis. So once you have the basics and know what types of crashes are overrepresented, you can start to look at where they're occurring and why they're occurring. So yes, that does take a bit more work, but if you have crash type data and information, you at least have the beginnings of being able to do a systemic analysis. So the scatter plot figure on the slide is just one example of what a crash type analysis might look like. On this particular graphic, you can see frequency on the bottom and severity on the side of the graphic. And if you look all the way towards the right, you can see that single vehicles are popping up as a crash type that's occurring frequently, and it's also very severe. So at the end of the day, again, it can help you understand more of what safety issues are happening in your particular planning area, and you can look at that and work with your stakeholders and try to think about, okay, what are some things that we can do infrastructure and behavioral-wise to address some of these severe crash types? And again, maybe we can start thinking about possibly initiating a systemic analysis. So many of you on the phone, probably just because you're all engaged in analysis, have maybe worked with a network screening or used the results of a DOT-driven network screening process. But what it is it's an identification and prioritization of specific locations, so segments or intersections that would benefit from safety improvements. And it basically identifies locations that are experiencing more crashes than would be expected for comparable sites. So this type of analysis, although it's a little bit more complex, it can do a lot of things for you. It can support an existing conditions assessment for any of your transportation plans. So you can say, look, we understand which segments and intersections are in need of improvements, and that's our baseline, so where are we going to go from here? You can use it to prioritize sites that you could then go out and do some further investigations using road safety audits or field studies. And another thing you can do with network screening is you could factor the results into your transportation project prioritization process. So you might give a scoring benefit to a project which also addresses a safety need that was identified through your network screening process. So one of the things to think about is if a network screening does seem too advanced for your agency, chances are your state DOT has probably conducted this type of analysis, and they can definitely share the results with you for review and possible inclusion in your planning document. So if they've identified maybe, I don't know, the top 50 intersections in the state and number 48 happens to be in your planning area, but that's your #1 priority, it's probably worthwhile to go out there and look at that particular intersection and figure out some improvements and report that back to your departments of transportation. So this is just an example of what the results of a network screening analysis might look like. And for this one in particular, it's for an intersection network screening, and the sites were ranked using a composite score, which is a little bit tertiary to this conversation, but I'll go through it anyway. So the score is made up of a combined frequency rank, equivalent property damage only rank, and then a crash rate rank. So as I was saying, again, if you know the top 10 sites in your planning area in need of improvements, you can use this information to go out there and study those and determine some solutions. And even if you only have analysis information on the state routes, it's at least a place to start and get folks thinking about safety and engage possibly through a road safety audit. So this map also shows the results of a network screening analysis, but we were talking about GIS earlier. Just generally speaking, I think personally, maps showing the results of any analysis type can really help planners, stakeholders, elected officials grasp the scope of a safety problem, where the issues are, and then help to further do some safety studies. So in doing workshops with some of the states that we work with, we found that maps like these are useful actually when working with 4E stakeholders, because it generates conversations not just about infrastructure improvements, but also if you're seeing a red segment and you have enforcement in the room, you have educators in the room, they can contribute to the conversation and say, oh, yeah, we haven't done any blitzes there in a while, but we noticed that impaired driving has been an uptick in that area. So it's a good way to generate conversation around the 4 E's and not just about infrastructure. So this is just a graphic pulled from the Highway Safety Manual. More information on network screening for systems planning can be found in the Highway Safety Manual if you're interested in learning more about that. But another cool thing about the Highway Safety Manual is that it can be used for corridor and intersection planning and alternatives analysis. So using a predictive method, planners can forecast expected crashes to proposed facility improvements. And what that does is it provides the opportunity to evaluate alternatives based on safety benefits. So if you're doing this type of analysis and you're trying to figure out what the benefits for mobility would be and what the benefits for air quality would be or resource protection, you can also include what are the benefits for safety improvements, which is a really cool idea. Let's see, the last type of analysis that you can use to inform your safety plans is systemic analysis. I'm sure you've all sat in on webinars on this before or are familiar with the concept, but basically it involves the wide implementation of low-cost safety improvements that address high-risk roadway features. So I'll walk you through the 3 basic steps of a systemic analysis pretty quickly. But again, local and rural planners, you might not conduct this type of analysis, but you can probably obtain the info from the state DOT as a starting point to learn which types of roadways and risk factors you could be considering in your planning documents. So again, quickly, the first task or first step in a systemic analysis is to identify focus crash types. So these are typically we went through this before, these are the crash types with the greatest number of severe crashes, and they represent the greatest potential to reduce fatalities and severe injuries. So in the example shown on this particular slide, roadway departures and rear-end crashes might be your focus crash type. And then the second step is to really figure out where the focus crash types are occurring. So in this example, the crash type is 2 or more vehicles, and then where are they occurring? Well, they're primarily occurring on principal arterials. So again, you're starting to narrow in a little bit more on what your problems are related to safety to then help you generate solutions that are a little bit more data-driven. And then the last and third step in systemic analysis, and this is a really simplified version, but hopefully makes it easy to follow along, is to then go to those locations where those crash types are occurring and identify and evaluate what the risk factors are. And there's a whole bunch of examples of risk factors on the slide. And it basically indicates a relationship between the characteristics of the crash location and then the overrepresentation of the focus crash type. So that's an overview of the different types of safety analysis methods that you all can be using, again, to develop safety plans or to use that information to inform the safety elements of any of your transportation plans. And Jamie, I'll turn it over to you for the poll questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I do want to also apologize. It was put in the chat pod that some of the text in some of the figures and graphics was a little small. We will address that for future webinars, and we do apologize for that. In the meantime, though, there is 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner. If you make your screen full screen, that could help a little bit. We also do have in the handout pod a copy of today's presentation so that you'd be able to also look at it afterwards in a little bit bigger font. But again, I do apologize for that, and we will make sure that in future webinars that we do make the text a bit bigger for you guys. We are going to move over to another poll break. And at the same time, if you do have any questions on what Nicole has just presented, feel free to put those into the chat pod. Our first poll question is identifying crash trends and contributing factors allows planners to answer which of the following questions. Is it who's involved in crashes? When are the crashes occurring? What are the major contributing factors to crashes, or all of the above? We're also looking for a little bit more information about you and your organization. So what types of analysis are you currently using? Benchmarking, contributing factors, crash types, systemic analysis, network screening, or predictive analysis. This one is a check all that apply. The last question is also a check all that apply, and that is what type of analysis would you like to be using or learn more about? And it gives the same options as the previous question. So we'll give you guys a few minutes to fill those out, and then we'll go ahead and have Nicole discuss the results. I do want to point out as well that in the chat pod, Missoula MPO has been nice enough as well to put a link to their online crash map from 2008 to 2013 in case anyone is interested in seeing what one of those looks like as well. So thank you for that, Missoula. All right, and Nicole, it does look like at this point we're finishing up with the polls, so I'm going to end those for you and broadcast them if you'd like to discuss the results.
Sure. I was actually just seeing that question for the first time and hoping that I got it right myself. Dana did the question for this section, but it was helpful that it looks like almost everyone chose all of the above, so I'm also going to go with all of the above for that one. But that is the correct answer. So it says identifying crash trends and contributing factors allows planners to answer which of the following, and yes, does allow you to get at the who, the when, and the what of crashes. So it looks like everyone answered that correctly, including myself. And then in terms of what types of analyses are you currently using, we put up all the ones that I just went through, and it looks like predominantly people are using contributing factors information, which is pretty common because that's usually what people use to get at emphasis areas if they identify those in their plans. And then people are also looking at crash type, and I wonder if they're looking at crash types because they're doing systemic analysis or if they're looking at them sort of independent of that. But it's also interesting that that's one of the most common ones. And then what's expected is, yeah, not as many folks are doing systemic and network and predictive analysis, but based on then the question below, it looks like that's actually one of the areas that people have the most interest in, is trying to learn and do more with those three, the systemic, the network, and the predictive analysis. So.
Okay, and it does not look like we have any other questions at this time, so I'm going to put you back into the presentation for the last section, Nicole. There you are.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the final piece of this training is what the heck do you do with all of the information that we just provided you on data and analysis. These are things that can almost happen in a silo sometimes, and they don't ever then get applied to the transportation planning process or are used to actually inform the planning process. They're used to inform the selection maybe of specific projects. So hopefully give you a little bit of insight on how data analysis results can be used to inform goals and objectives, your performance measures and targets, and then eventually your projects and programs. So I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic before. It's been around for a while, but it shows the basic elements of the performance-based planning process, and it is tailored to a safety spin. So I'm just going to quickly go through it because I think it's important. But at the highest level, the vision describes what your ideal but realistic future is. And then you have goals that are still high level, but they get a little bit more specific and talk about concrete opportunities to actually achieve that vision that you set for yourself. And then objectives are where you get more specific, and they describe how you're actually going to meet those goals of the plan. And then programs and projects are identified to meet the goals and objectives. So you don't want to identify programs and projects that aren't helping your overall goals and vision for what you see for your planning area. And then lastly, the performance measures and targets, the newer-ish piece, they're used to assess and evaluate how those programs and projects are then meeting the objectives, goals, and ultimately the vision. So basically, to ensure that at the end of the day, the right investments are being made, the point of this slide is to show you that data-driven decisions really need to start at the beginning of the planning process. They really need to start with your vision and your goal and your objectives to lay out that framework for which programs and projects will give us the best bang for our buck to then meet those goals and objectives. So I think the results of any safety analysis can help you set up a similar data-driven framework for your own agencies. So for each of the analysis types that I reviewed in the previous section, I'm just going to go through each and discuss how they can be used to inform your transportation planning process. So when a benchmarking analysis is completed, which again, it's used, high level to set a baseline and assess trends. So it's bigger picture data, your fatalities, your serious injuries, your crashes. But what it can do is it can be used to develop the need for a general safety goal. So a general goal might be something like increase safety for all users by reducing transportation-related fatalities and serious injuries. So at a minimum, benchmarking is saying, yes, we recognize that safety is a concern and we need to do something about it, so we are going to set a goal in our planning process. So since with the benchmarking you're typically looking at the higher level data, you probably won't have enough information to set those specific objectives, but one thing you can do is you can start to gather information on safety activities that are already occurring in your area, or you can start thinking about some opportunities to maybe collect more information to set some specific objectives. So again, at a minimum, a basic high-level goal, and what's already occurring in your region. What are some things that are already happening to maybe help meet that goal? It's taking credit for things that are already occurring. Since benchmarking looks at the baseline and trends, it's easy to use this type of analysis to establish performance measures and targets. I think it's evident with the graphic on the slide how you can do that. And then while benchmarking doesn't really provide you enough info to get at those data-driven programs and projects yet, I mean, you don't really know what your needs are at this point, but you can adopt or reference in your plans other effective safety programs and projects. So looking for things that are proven or that have already worked in your region or in the state might be a good place to start in terms of having conversation about programs and projects potentially to implement in the planning area. So with the contributing factors analysis, again, you have more information about a crash. It tells you the who, the what, the when, the why, and the where. And this level of information, it can be used to set a general safety goal similar to what was done with the benchmarking analysis, but if you choose, you could also start setting more specific safety goals with this type of analysis. So the example on the slide is you could set a goal to reduce lane departure fatalities. With this additional data or more data, you can also start thinking about specific objectives that would help you meet this goal. So for example, your goals, reduce lane departure fatalities. your objective might be identify locations to prioritize lane departure countermeasures. So again, you're starting to set up that framework of what your data is showing you and how are you going to go about addressing it to eventually identify programs and projects to meet those goals and objectives. So one thing you can choose to do outside of establishing performance measures for fatalities, serious injuries, and rates is you can start to establish and track performance measures by the specific goals that you set. So the example here is number of lane departure fatalities, and if you have the data to be able to set a goal for lane departures, typically you'll have the data to be able to track and evaluate how those numbers are changing over the years. And again, down the line, it just helps you with your investments. Do we need to invest more in lane departure fatalities because the numbers aren't going down, or have the numbers gone down significantly? So maybe we can put resources somewhere else that seems problematic. So it's one way to do the performance measures with contributing factor data. And then you can also start thinking a little bit more seriously at programs and projects at this point, and at a minimum you could adopt or reference any applicable ones into your plan that are already in other plans in the region or things that are already happening in the region. You could also consider specific safety programs that address your priority issues. So if you've identified lane departures, what are some effective countermeasures that would help address that? And then part of the contributing factor analysis does show where crashes are occurring. It doesn't necessarily give you any specifics, but it gives you enough information to see where there's clusters or high crash locations or things like that, and you can go out and start conducting road safety audits, which then eventually leads to programs and projects. So crash types is very similar to the results you get from a contributing factor analysis, but again, it basically tells you a bit more of the story. So it can help you set a more specific goal if you choose. It can help you set more specific objectives to meet that goal. So the example on the slide is, you might be wanting to reduce single vehicle crashes. So what objectives are going to help you get at that particular goal? You can also develop performance measures to track progress for those specific goals, because you'll have the data to have been able to set a goal. And again, you can also identify programs and projects that are addressing those specific goals and objectives the same you would as the contributing factor analysis. The one thing that crash type data does also help you with is, again, it provides that piece of information necessary to start a systemic analysis, which would eventually help you get more at programs and projects in your planning area. So the results of network screening analysis, same as before in terms of the goals and objectives, but different from the other analysis methods, you can do something a little bit different in the performance measures category. So if you wanted to, you could actually track the performance of those intersections and segments that you have identified through the network screening process. So you can get a high-level sense of, okay, so this corridor, it was one of our worst. We had 80 crashes, 5 were fatalities. You can actually track over time and see how that's changing. So that's one thing you can do with performance. You can also evaluate the before and after impacts of some of those implemented solutions at those locations. So you can get a little bit more specific on what the results are of the things that you're actually deploying in these particular areas that need them the most. So another option at this stage too is that you can factor the results of the network screening into the prioritization process for all your transportation projects. So an example of that is you might have a maintenance project coming up, and it might score higher or move higher up the rank if it also addresses a location on the network screening list. So you're going out doing this maintenance project, but it's also in an area that was identified for a safety improvement. So the addition or the implementation of a safety countermeasure there might make this now a more viable or interesting project, or one that gives you a little bit more bang for your buck. And then lastly, the last way you can think about using safety analysis, specifically systemic, in your planning process is that it can help you set those more specific goals and objectives if you choose. You can track the overall performance of the system after improvements have been made, or again, you can track the before and after results at specific locations. And it also helps you select and prioritize those safety projects or incorporate the results of that analysis into the transportation project prioritization process for all of your projects. Again, what I just talked about in the network screening example. So that's how the results of the analysis that I went through in the previous section can really help inform your planning process and help you think more about, okay, what are those goals and objectives? What are my performance measures? And then how do I select the best programs and projects to meet those? So with that, Jamie, I'll turn it back over to you for the final poll questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And it does look like we have a few questions in the chat pod, but for anyone else who would like to ask one, please go ahead and put that in at this time. This will be the last question and answer section that we do have. We do have 3 poll questions for you. Again, which methods can be used as inputs into network screening? Crash frequency, crash rate, equivalent property damage only, or all of the above? And then the next 2, again, are a little bit more about what your agency is doing, and they're select all that apply. So what areas has your agency had success in, and what areas does your agency need additional assistance in? And the options are data collection, data analysis, using data to develop goals and objectives, using data to set performance measures and targets, and using data to identify projects. And we'll give you guys a few minutes to go ahead and fill those out. And it does look like we have a few people continuing to take the polls. So I'm going to give you a question, Nicole. One of the questions is, how might crash types be separated? For example, when considering the top 3, how do you classify, consider, or treat young drivers speeding and run off the road?
Yeah, I looked at that question. I don't know. That's getting into the intricacies of a systemic analysis, which I do not have the answer to that question, or the follow-up one that comes after that. Dana, I don't know if you have any particular insights on that one, or others that might be on the phone and can contribute in the chat pod.
Right. I will say that in reading the question, my interpretation of it is, how do you address crashes that have multiple contributing factors? So the example was a young driver that's speeding and runs off the road. And what I will say is that if you look at most of the crashes that you will be targeting, they overlap greatly between both behavioral and infrastructure-related characteristics. So one of the things that is sort of set up in the process is that, sure, you may or may not target a crash by a young driver that's speeding that runs off the road, but if it depends. Do you have speeding as an emphasis area in your plan, or do you have any speeding related countermeasures? And then for running off the road, that's a roadway departure crash. So it depends. Do you have any roadway departure related strategies or countermeasures in your plan or in your plan of action? Are you addressing young drivers in any way? So you may or may not have an emphasis area for young drivers, roadway departure, and speeding, but you could potentially have some sort of countermeasure in if you had a young driver's emphasis area that targeted aggressive driving behaviors or something of that nature. So when we address how you mitigate any type of crash, most times it is targeting crashes that have multiple factors. That's just the complication of traffic safety issues. They're usually related to a number of factors. And I don't know if there are others who have some experience that they'd like to talk about related to that. But yes, there are overlapping contributing factors.
We did have one comment put into the chat pod that says that first they screen the crash by type of interest, and then prioritize it by safety. Okay. And I am going to end the polls at this time and go ahead and let you talk about those, Nicole, and then we do have 2 additional questions in the chat pod that we'll address afterwards.
Sure.
So you should be able to see the results.
Yep, I can see the results, and I actually helped Dana with this question, so I knew the answer ahead of time, which is good. The answer is all of the above, but when conducting a network screening, you can actually do each of these independent of each other, or you can do some sort of composite score like the one I showed you, and there actually might be some other inputs that can be used in a network screening process that aren't even listed here. And then, let's see, what areas has your agency had success? I think we've gone over this a little bit in some of the other questions, but predominantly it's data collection and data analysis. And then a little bit behind that is using data to identify projects, a little bit less so in terms of developing goals and objectives and setting performance measures and targets. And then where does your agency need additional assistance? And I think sort of piggybacking off the second question, it's more in that using data to develop those goals and objectives and set performance measures and targets, which provide you with that framework to then eventually get at your programs and data-driven programs and projects. So, and yeah, it looks like less people need help with data collection and analysis, but I think that's pretty consistent with what we were seeing earlier in some of the poll questions.
Perfect, thank you. The next question that you have in the chat pod is, what is the typical lag time for crash data from state DOTs?
Yeah, I think a couple people are putting in answers there. I think it's probably different for each state, but I think you're seeing about within a year, it looks like, is what people are saying. Some say 6 to 18 months. I'm sure everyone has a different answer they could pop in here.
Okay, and another question for you is that they found 27% of the crashes are from the interaction between the infrastructure, so the geometry and traffic control, and road users. How do you include this in your planning studies? You have not mentioned it.
So I think, if the issue is, let's see, infrastructure and road users, so I'm guessing an infrastructure and a behavioral issue happening concurrently, the best way to go about that is through collaboration with your stakeholders. I think I talked about it in the analysis section. Using maps is always a good way to demonstrate where those overlaps are, and then getting people to have a discussion about, okay, what can we do to address this in terms of maybe project infrastructure countermeasures, as well as some of those behavioral ideas as well. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is to actually have the people in the room who can talk not just about infrastructure, but can also talk about some of the behavioral issues. So that would be your law enforcement folks, your educators, Your highway safety office is also another good resource for that. And then a lot of regions and communities actually have community traffic safety team or other regional safety type coalitions, so I think engaging them in the conversations is also important.
Thank you, and we do have a follow-up question to one of the previous ones that came in. It said that, of course, we would assume that all crashes have multiple contributing factors. The original question referred more to how might the data skew the analysis and thus the treatment. So in New Mexico, they found going to the crash report is the crash report narrative is paramount to truly evaluating the crashes and determining the appropriate safety treatments.
Yep. I agree. Yeah. Sometimes that's the only way you really can figure it out. And that's also why, while the data is great and is very important and it points you in a particular direction, Nicole talked quite a bit about road safety audits, or there's various names that are used for them, but that's another method that can be used to understand what are some of the multiple reasons that crashes are occurring and what are maybe some things that the data aren't telling you because it's simply not there. It's not in the database, but it's either in the long form crash report or if you go out to the location while doing RSA, you can look at both the infrastructure related and behavioral related issues that could be coming into play. Great point.
Thank you. And we did also have some more information put in as well about how to include the infrastructure and road user behavior information into your planning studies. And the suggestion is to use the NCHRP 600 Human Factors Guidelines in order to be able to do this. So for anyone else looking into that information, that would be a great resource. We also had a question regarding, while our poll question asked about whether or not you needed help with data collection, they're wondering if there may have been a greater need if we had talked about your need for help with data collection for non-motorized versus motorized.
I agree. That's probably true. I mean, that's an area that, one, with the new requirements in performance-based planning that the non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries are tracked as a performance measure for, I'm sure that has, we know that the crashes or bicycle and pedestrian related data is a lot more sparse than we are on the other side. And that there are some states or even local agencies that would need some help in that department. So that's a great point to add.
And I do want to thank everyone who's put in great questions and comments into the chat pod. Thank you to everyone who shared their experience as well. It does look like we had a few additional things about the time lag for crash data. Some say that they usually receive the previous year's data in March of the next year. Some said 6 to 18 months or the beginning of the calendar year to end of the year beginning to be reported in June. So March versus June of the next year. And then we did have one that says they are being able to get it now, real time, Arkansas, because they're moving to using an e-crash system. Not every police agency is using it now, only the state police, but others are getting on board. And this has made it a lot quicker because before it used to be up to 2 years before they would get the data that they were needing. So thank you again to everyone who provided information and shared your experience in the chat pod. We do appreciate that. Today in the webinar, we hope that you have learned how to summarize the purpose of transportation safety planning, to list approaches to collect safety data, to compare safety analysis methods, and to identify opportunities to apply safety data and analysis to the planning process. I do want to thank both of our speakers, Dana and Nicole, for providing the information that they did today. I will remind you that today's webinar has been recorded and will be available within a week on our website, along with the PowerPoint slides and the other 2 handouts that are in the handout pod currently. We do have a couple of upcoming webinars. Our webinar in June will be June 1st, and it will be held by ITE, and they will be sharing their brand new Vision Zero virtual toolbox and website that was just released last week. And then in July, we will be having a speaker from Iowa talk to us about how to address roadway safety issues for ATVs and other off-road vehicles. Those are available to be registered for right now on our website, and we will be sending the emails out to our distribution list as well. We also have 2 training videos available on our website, Introduction to Road Safety Audits on Tribal Lands and Introduction to Road Safety Culture. Those are both available on our website and on our YouTube channel. And if you have any additional questions about today's webinar, you can contact our 2 speakers, Nicole and Dana, at the email addresses on your screen now, or as always, you can call the Safety Center at our 844 number or reach us at info@ruralsafetycenter.org. So again, thank you, Dana and Nicole, for presenting. We do appreciate your time today.
Thank you, and thanks to the group of attendees. I thought there were some great questions and some great discussion points provided also.
Okay, thank you all, and have a great afternoon.